Good day, everybody. My name is Dr. Francois Tessier. I am the CEO of the Center for Complementary Therapy and Pain Management in Sri Lanka. And welcome to this series of Zoom interview where we will discover the most amazing doctors, therapists, psychologists, zoo therapists, philosophers, artists, shaman, healer, etc., that are practicing complementary therapies worldwide and that help us to view the world differently. And today we have someone that view the world differently. We have a very unusual subject with a very special guest. Our guest today is Dr. Raymond Moody, a philosopher, a psychologist, a physician, and a best-selling author, and mainly a foremost expert on the phenomenon called near-death experience. Dr. Moody is widely known for his book about life after death and near-death experience, a term that he coined in 1975 in his best-selling book, Life After Life. Dr. Moody earned a PhD in philosophy from the University of Virginia, another PhD in psychology from the University of West Georgia, where he later became a professor in this topic. In '76, he was also awarded MD from the Medical College of Georgia. After obtaining his MD, Dr. Moody worked as a forensic psychiatrist in a maximum security Georgia State Hospital. In 1998, Dr. Moody was appointed chair in consciousness studies at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Dr. Moody is a dynamic lecturer, and he has enlightened audiences all over the world over 3 decades and offered many different lectures, workshops, presentations on the topic of near-death experience. Dr. Moody, the least we can say is that your career is out of the ordinary. I could have said so much more to introduce you, so I'll stop here, and that's a pleasure to welcome you. Thank you for accepting my invitation, Doctor.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm just delighted to talk with you today.
Thank you, Doctor. Well, I have my first question, and we'll jump into the core of the subject. My first question is quite simple. I hope you won't be angry with me because it's so simple. It is, for the audience, what do you define as a near-death experience? What is it? It's simple, no?
Well, it's simple and yet it's not. And this is something that has been known in the West literally since the beginning. Plato and Democritus and Heraclitus were all interested in near-death experiences. And so what it happens to be is that an appreciable proportion of the people who get, for example, resuscitated following a cardiac arrest, or who are revived from a close call with death, will talk about a common pattern of experience that unfolds at that time. And people say that they often hear the doctor say some such words as, "Oh my God, he's dead," or "We've lost him." But from their point of view, they say that they seem to leave their physical bodies and they can watch and they can see from a point of view above, they can see the resuscitation going on down below. And they tell us that they become aware of a passageway of some sort, which they liken to a tunnel. And they go through this passageway and come out on the other side into an incredibly brilliant and warm, bright light.
Right.
Far brighter than anything they've ever seen while they're alive. And in this light, they feel complete comfort and love and peace. They tell us that relatives or friends of theirs who have already died seem to be there to meet them and to help them through this transition. And they undergo holographic memory, in which they say that every event of their lives is displayed around them instantly in a panorama, sort of holographic panorama.
So
And they,
three-dimensional.
yes, and they, it is, and or multidimensional in a way. And they say that when you see yourself in that panorama doing some action, then when the action results, then you are in the consciousness of those with whom you've interacted. So if you see yourself doing a mean-spirited action to someone, then you feel the sad feelings you brought about in that person's life. Or if you see yourself doing a loving action, you feel the good feelings you brought about.
Right.
So people who go through this come back saying that it persuades them that what we call death is a transition into another reality.
Oh, well, doctor, why did you came out to search for this specific phenomenon? How did it appear in your life? Because it's a very uncommon subject. How did you develop such a passion for this subject?
Well, yeah, when I was a young kid, my parents were not religious, thankfully for me. And I was interested in astronomy. And I had no religious background to speak of as a child. I think I went to church about 3 times, as I remember, and it just wasn't a pleasant deal to me.
So your first source of inspiration was Plato.
I was very impressed with what Plato had to say, and but I never understood that it was anything about other than pertaining to ancient Greece. And so when I 3 years later, I actually met a human being, a living man, Dr. George Ritchie, who had had such an experience. And so that was what got started. That was in 1965. And I finished my PhD in philosophy in 1969. And I, when I was a philosophy professor, began to hear these stories from my students and my fellow professors. So that was how it developed with me.
Did the people believe you at that moment when you started to talk about near-death experience? Maybe people thought you were a little bit cuckoo because that was something not accepted or unknown. Let's say it like that. It was an unknown phenomenon, right? Was it?
Yeah. Well, you know something, Francois, to tell you the truth, I am immune to things like that. Yes, there were some doubters, but philosophy, I am so pleased that I was a philosophy major before I went to medical school, because it's always been part of my worldview that most people just aren't very curious. It's astonishing to me. And if anything arises which seems to challenge their sense of what they think they know, they get disturbed. And so that is a part of life to me. However, I will say this, that it makes a good story to say that poor Dr. Moody was persecuted by the medical community and thought he was crazy. And that's a wonderful story. My wife says I do have a little bit of a martyr complex. So it's a story. But in fact, Francois, it just never happened.
You didn't.
I've been investigating near-death experiences for 10 years when I entered medical school in 1972.
Hmm.
And because I had friends in the medical school, the word had circulated among the faculty before I came in September of 72, that a student was coming in that year who had studied these experiences. And within the first 2 weeks of medical school, 8 of my professors contacted me and said, Dr. Moody, thank you for investigating this.
Oh,
Because some of them had had such an experience themselves, others had heard it from their patients. So I did not have the sort of obligatory period of agony that people are supposed to have when they introduce something like this, at least from the medical community.
yes.
However, it created an awful sensation among the religious people. And I had quite a number of communications from distressed fundamentalist Christians. But, that was disturbing at first, but after a while you can get to where you can laugh at it, right? So I really haven't had the suffering that one is supposed to have when one introduces a new topic. I attribute it all to Plato and the ancient Greeks. That's how I found out about it. But what happened was in the 1960s and 70s, the techniques of cardiopulmonary resuscitation expanded so remarkably that there were just a lot more people in that time who had experienced this. Whereas in the ancient world, it was very rare to be revived. In the 60s and 70s, in Europe and the United States, it became almost a daily occurrence. So that was why I think that when I did publish that book, nobody could deny it really, because as soon as they asked their aunt or nephew or whatever, they would have a case right there. So
Yeah.
I didn't really go through the suffering that people imagine.
And you investigated the subject on a medical point of view also, because you are a medical doctor also, isn't it?
Well, that might have had something to do with the acceptance of it, because people respect MD degrees. But in terms of the reality of the situation, the reason why that book was so well put together was that I was a philosophy professor. Because in the real world, in 2020, the question of life after death is not yet a scientific question. It's not yet a question that we can confirm or disconfirm by the scientific method.
Is it?
But it's a philosophical question, and it's still a great philosophical question. I don't think that we have advanced very much past what Plato said in his Phaedo, which I learned later from Bertrand Russell, that Plato's Phaedo was the basis of the Christian point of view of the afterlife.
Yes.
But it all came from Plato, and nobody has ever really, I think, done a better analysis than Plato's Phaedo. Plato's work, the Phaedo, is still the finest work that's ever been done on the question of life after death from the genuinely rational perspective. I am not a parapsychologist.
Oh.
I think that when somebody tells you that, that there can be a scientific evidence of life after death, I don't think they know what they're talking about.
Mm.
I think it's just not articulated enough yet to be a scientific question, but it's still a very important philosophical question. Matter of fact, it may be the important philosophical question.
Yes, more than a medical question for now, but it will come to that later. Thanks to
yes, I would say now it has medical implications as well.
Yes.
But those with clinical implications, right? In other words, that doctors need to know that when they resuscitate a patient, that it's quite possible that they will have a near-death experience. So from the medical point of view, what the doctor needs to do is to, number one, listen to the patient's description of what happened, because people want somebody to. And secondly, to reassure them that they're not alone, that lots of people have this experience. And that's what the clinical implications of this work is.
But it's quite narrow as opposed to the philosophical aspect.
Well, the philosophical aspect is a lot bigger. It is. You know, Francois, as you must be, I'm often questioned by people. What to come to terms with death? This is a question I hear all the time from people. And I've learned from my life experience that if somebody who is old is asking me this question, I can't help them. But when a young person asks me that question, I can very enthusiastically say that what you should do is you should study philosophy. In Plato's Phaedo, he says, philosophy is a rehearsal for dying. And I remember I read that when I was 18 years old, and it had an amazing impact on me. Now at age 75, I often think when I look back that it is kind of remarkable that an 18-year-old would have responded so strongly to that, but for whatever reason I did. And Plato was right that if you spend your whole life thinking about death, then when the reality of it approaches, you're okay with it. But I think it's very difficult to people who have spent their life in business, for example. I hear a lot of people who come to me who are businessmen who've spent their whole life making money. In the 70s, and the question of life after death presents itself. And they don't have the mental background to think of this. And so I think it's not very satisfactory to how to help people who are older. But people who are young, we can tell them to study philosophy, and that's the best single thing you can do.
Yes.
To come to terms with death.
Yes, yes. There is something that comes to my mind, Dr. Moody, is in fact, by studying the near-death experience phenomenon, it helps us, or does it help us to understand life? Because you try to understand life by analyzing what happens after life, right? So how does it do it? How does it help us to understand life? Because I suspect it does.
I think it does too. And again, I have to go back to Plato on that one, because he made that point very beautifully in his writings, that really it's, if you don't spend time in your life confronting the notion of death, you're living just a half existence. And, you know, I think that Aristotle's famous definition of a narrative is a story has a beginning and a middle and an end. And life has that same structure. You know, a philosophical question of great importance is, what constitutes your personal identity? And that's a very big philosophical question. And the person who, again, sort of created the first stab at it was Plato, who said that the person is made of a material body and an immaterial soul. And he said the body has no reality to it. It's just flux and flow. But what is real about us is our immaterial soul. And that worked pretty well. I mean, you know, you could have been put to the burned at the stake during Middle Ages for not subscribing to that. But with that, when that loosened up, Hobbes, for example, Thomas Hobbes, made the famous statement that notion of an immaterial soul is unintelligible, that there's no clear cognitive content to it. And so then in that next 100 years or so, John Locke tried to create a new understanding of personal identity, but by saying that our personal identity consists of our memories. But working as a forensic psychiatrist and testifying in court and such, I quickly realized that memory is a very variable phenomenon.
Yes.
And so we're still left with the question of what is, I think you remember, you are old enough to remember Elie Wiesel. Elie Wiesel said, God made man because he loves stories. And I think that's correct. What is your personal identity except for your story? And the personal identity of Raymond Moody is Raymond Moody's life story. And that fits in very well, I think, with the whole notion of reincarnation. Because as I've gathered from my own children, who, you know, they're not exposed to religious things, and yet both of them, and they didn't even know about my book, Life After Life, until they looked me up on the internet, right? So this is not something my kids are into, but both of them related very, very clear memories of where they were before they came to us. And in both cases, in such a way that we could verify what they were talking about. So not from any scholarly perspective, but from what my own kids tell me, I've come to see that, you know, there what is called reincarnation. I think it's more complicated than that. But I think that the structure of that is correct. That it's life is story. And you finish one story and then you go through an incomprehensible process and then we're back on another story.
This is very
beyond that, I just don't know.
This is very
Buddhist. I'm willing to wait and see.
This is very near to Buddhist explanations of how reincarnations is, because they don't know what's there. They don't believe so much into soul. They believe that we are refused and we reunite again, but they are not having the concept of soul as Christianity has, for example. Their concept of soul is a complete dematerialization of the personality.
Yeah, I'm not much on the notion of a soul. I think that it's you know, it's not very clearly defined. And I was lecturing a few years ago in the Bahamas at an ashram. And I was saying to the people there that in my life, I've come to think that, again, that what this is all about is story, and that you go through one life story and then you go through another experience and then you come back on another life story. And after my lecture, the Swami came up and he said, yeah, that's what the Hindus have figured out too, that this is the closest human analogy to this thing is that this is a theater we're in. Yes. And I think that's absolutely correct. It's Plato, as you know, was onto the same idea and the allegory of the cave, right?
Yeah.
And if you think it through, we are the people in the cave, and the whole story is much bigger than anything that we can conceive while we're here.
Yet we are curious to understand it, right? Even if it's bigger than us, we are still questioning what it is, right? So our curiosity
Yes.
is to try to understand that.
Curiosity is what it's all about to me, Francois. I just, I see, as you must too in your practice, how many people are just have no curiosity. And that is incredible to me. I just don't understand why some people have no curiosity, and who, if they think at all, it's in accordance with some ideology, right? That they think they've got the answers and they need to do no further inquiry. I mean, to me, the fun of life is to find out new things.
Yeah.
Within the context that I know full well that I'll never know much of it. When
No.
I looked through a telescope first time when I was 7 or 8 years old, I figured, well, I'll never know much of anything. And that's okay. But it's fun to learn what you can.
Yeah, it pushes you. Right. So on the point of view of the experiencers, there is a lot of myth about when they come back, they become this and that and the other. And you viewed, and I met some, I would say like 5 or 6 people in my life that have lived this experience. And what is your experience of that, Dr. Raymond? What do they become? The experiencer, when they come back after a near-death experience, it's quite a moment in your life, and there is transformation. Can you talk about their transformation after they come back?
Yes. One is that they have no more fear of death, because they say that their experience convinced them that what we call death is simply a transition into another realm. And also, Pierre, you remind me so much of my friend Pierre, the same affect almost. So I keep thinking of you as him. But Francois, I'm sure you've realized in your practice too, as I did when I first started. One of the first early experiences I had of an insight was that everybody seemed to be chasing something.
Yeah.
All of my were chasing. Some of them were chasing power. Some of them were chasing fame. Some of them were chasing money. And I remember being so puzzled by that. And I went to my supervisor, Dr. Buckman, and I was saying, that's just amazing to me, John, how everybody's chasing something. I said, I'm just not chasing anything. And he smiled and he nodded and he said, Raymond, how old were you when you got your second doctoral degree? And I said, 30 years old. And so then it dawned on me, of course, I have spent my life chasing knowledge. So everything is changing. But what I have observed about people with near-death experiences is that whatever they were chasing before the experience, when they come back, they say the same thing, namely, that what this is all about is learning how to love, right? Sure, you've the same thing. So, and they say also that it doesn't make that any easier. My friend George Ritchie that I mentioned, this wonderful man, the finest human being I ever knew, he was the first person I knew, living person I knew, who had a near-death experience. And George said to me in 1976, he said, Raymond, this experience makes your humanity even more of a burden in a way. And what he was getting at is George was a very kind-hearted man, and he didn't say things in unkind ways. But if I could translate that, what he meant, into a more, succinct formulation, what he about is, let's face it, it's very difficult to get through the average day without wanting to choke at least one person, right? Isn't isn't that? No, it is.
That's very eloquent.
What George was saying is that you have this experience of the importance of love, but you're back here and you're still into that same framework, right? So it sets them off on a spiritual quest. George would wake up at 4 o'clock every morning to meditate and to pray before he started doing his rounds at the hospital with his patients. And so love, the importance of the quest for love. And also another thing people say, everybody says the thing about the love, but some people also go on to say that they think learning is very important. They say that in their life review, this being that they are with sort of slows down where scenes come up in which they had been learning things. And what people say is that they understand from what they saw was that the process of learning goes on literally for eternity. There is no end. People talk about seeing institutions of higher learning on the other side. George Ritchie, this man I mentioned, he said he saw into this institution of higher learning, for want of a better term. And he said he was in one aspect of this institution that was comparable to a library. And he said the one area of this library that he sort of saw into listed up the books of the universe. So,
Wow.
looking forward to getting to that library myself.
Yes, me too. Yet I enjoy my present life, but I think it's something very encouraging. Are there people that come back and which have had difficult experience, or which can't cope with their life after passing through this experience?
Yes, there have been. In the survey that was done by the Gallup organization, the pollsters in the United States, in 1979, they said that a very small fraction of them are hellish or unpleasant. And I can't remember if it was 0.3% or maybe 3%, but a very small percentage. And that has been my experience as well. But yes, I do hear negative ones, but they are very rare compared to the positive ones. And since it's more difficult to study a small number than a large number, what can you say? Also, the negative ones seem to be very varied. There are many different types of them.
Yeah.
Whereas the positive ones are more homogeneous.
Yeah, yeah.
And all of this is further complicated by the fact that I can easily imagine that somebody who had an unpleasant experience might be more reluctant to talk about it, right?
Right.
So in that sense, it may be an undercount. But my basic answer is I just don't know. But I haven't talked to enough of them to get any clear picture
Of that.
A lot of times it seems more of a delirium to me that they're describing. And a delirium is acute organic mental syndrome, characterized by very surrealistic imagery and very vivid
Right.
hallucinatory imagery. So that's kind of what my assessment was of a certain number of the patients I talked to had unpleasant experiences that they were describing a delirium.
Yes.
And so no two were alike.
Mhm. I understand. Some of the experiencers, like Dr. Alexander Dr. Eben, have had
Yeah.
an enlightenment, right? Kind of an enlightenment. He had traversed a complete transformation. Uh, do you encounter that phenomenon oftenly, or it's just a rare phenomenon?
Oh, yeah, complete transformations are very common in this. And I know Eben well, he's one of my best friends, and I've also known him from, I know colleagues of his, uh, like at Harvard,
Yeah.
who, um, and they came to one of my lectures in Florida a couple of years ago, and they were just astonished at Eben's experience because they knew that knowing him that he's reliable. So they were astonished at the transformation and personality. They said he was always a very nice guy, but that he was a typical academician. And then that after this transformation, he's got it all together in a very nice way.
Mm. Yet he is still very academic. I mean, he doesn't lose his
He
knowledge.
is,
He doesn't
he is, but he's
aspect
got
of
the
personality.
other aspect of his himself going too as well.
Yeah, yeah. It's quite a fascinating balance in between the personality. He's a good example of that. Uh,
Yeah.
right. Is there any physical consequences when you come back, such as under oxygenation of the brain or conditions of their heart, medical conditions of the patient when they come back, having some difficulty with the physical aspect? Is there something such like that?
Well, sometimes there is. That they got some physical um, problem from the close call with death. But in the great majority of cases, people that I've talked with who got resuscitated, that they were okay. They didn't have any long. Some do, but most don't. Most seem,
Most don't have anything.
yeah, most seem to get through a cardiac arrest fairly easily. I've read reports on that too. How that medical reports on how it's not as you might expect, but that people who are resuscitated generally do well.
Yeah. Is there any observation such as endorphin secretions and endocrinal system that might help them to cope with some mental conditions, or there is nothing like that? They become exactly where, physically, I mean, they become exactly where they were before.
Well, now, Francois, I'm going to get over into the area of me that may sound psychotic. But like I said, I got my PhD in philosophy before I went to medical school.
Yeah.
And to me, consciousness, again, is still a philosophical question. And the point of view that you're kind of alluding to there is the point of view of the neuroscientists,
Yeah.
which is called epiphenomenalism. And that is the point of view that there is no independent reality to consciousness,
Right.
but that the primary reality is the physical and chemical reactions in the brain, electrochemical reactions. And what people who get, you can't require that somebody who's going to go into neurosciences get a PhD in philosophy,
Yeah.
before they go, but they ought to, because this question of consciousness, the mind-body problem, as it's called, and anybody who thinks that we're close to a resolution of that, I just think they haven't studied hard enough. And so what I'm getting at here is that in terms of what I think about this, I am still much more in the perspective of the group called the idealists, like George Berkeley and so on. To me, I think that consciousness is the primary reality. And I talked to Eben about this a couple of years ago, and I said, Eben, I think that the brain is a projection of consciousness.
Yeah.
And he said, absolutely. Yes, so that's what I think. It's the whole thing of physicality is just like a backstory we have to bring everybody on board to weave their life stories together. It's like I would say that I am not a physicalist.
I understand.
I've even channeled. Yeah.
I can relate to what you say because I'm a therapist and I connect with subtle energies of the body, and I mean energy can be directed by consciousness, literally consciousness, and it's not material, it's not physical. I don't believe it's in the brain. I don't believe it's there.
That's right.
Right. All right. So, Dr. Moody, there was a research that you were not directly doing, but that you were involved in linguistic, where there is a linguist, I believe a lady linguist, that was studying nonsensical language of the dying person. Talk to me about that. I was fascinating by that study. Is there any publications of that?
Well, there is, Francois, and in Life After Life, I say at the very beginning of the book that I come into this from a background in philosophy, and that my specific areas of interest in philosophy are logic and philosophy of language. And since I was doing my doctoral dissertation in 1969 on this, what I'm interested in is the unintelligible domain of language. Because we all know what literal meaning is, and we all know what figures of speech is. But most of us have the attitude that nonsense is just a complete blank, right? It's something totally beyond our kin, and something totally over in the non-existent realm. But I have been fascinated by this literally since childhood. And my new book on the subject is called Making Sense of Nonsense.
Oh.
It's been published in January by Llewellyn Publishers in the United States. And it's based on a college course, a university course I did. I taught many times an entire semester-length course on nonsense, which was well attended by attorneys and people in the advertising business and intelligence officers and literary professors, because this is a very important aspect. I mean, in France, the nonsense literature is not as appreciated as it is in England and the United States, for example. But in France, it's more grown up. Like you have Samuel Beckett, right? Yeah. Like in Waiting for Godot would be an example.
The existentialists. I'm French Canadian, so I know very much. The existentialists are a very important movement of philosophy in the 70s, the 60s, the 50s.
Yes. And so that's what my interest is. And it's what I've learned is that if you prepare people in advance with a logical system for thinking logically about unintelligible things, then when subsequently they have a near-death experience, they will be able to put it into words for the rest of us in an entirely new way. And you know, the most common thing that people with near-death experiences report is that no matter how many degrees they have, they say, I just can't describe it to you. There are no words. And so what I have worked out is a way around that problem so that now we can reformat our mind in advance to comprehend our near-death experiences better when we have them subsequently.
Mm, right. Uh, right. So the medical point of view I covered. What is your next field of research? Because you said that you are searching for knowledge and you will not stop, and I believe you. What are you on right now, Dr. Moody? What is your next field of research?
Well, actually, I've been working for about 10 years, Francois, on a book on God. Not being religious as a kid, and having very little contact with organized religion, I have come up with my take on God through listening to people with near-death experiences and also through my own personal spiritual experiences. So the book I'm working on now is called God is Bigger Than the Bible. And not so much in France and Quebec, but certainly in the United States. You know, that phrase puts people into a state of cognitive dissonance, right? If you,
I understand
yeah,
very well.
yeah. And, you know, because some people don't distinguish. So I'm saying that a lot of people who think they're worshiping God are really bibliolaters. What a bibliolatry is the worship of a book, right? So I'm saying that I I want God, but I don't want religion. So
Yes,
that's what the new book is about.
I understand. So yeah, well, I was about to ask you the connection with the spirituality, but because I've seen some of your publications where you seem to right now change your point of view according to what was your point of view before about spirituality, and because of your journey, because of what you discovered, because of what you find out, right? Is it? So today you do not think the same way as before, isn't it?
That's right. You know, when I published Life After Life, I just didn't know what to think. I knew it didn't have anything to do with oxygen deprivation to the brain, because one of my own medical school professors told me about her own experience when she was trying unsuccessfully to resuscitate her mother. But when she was, my professor herself went out of her own body and saw this light and saw the tunnel and saw her mother recede off into the light. Then after her mother passed away, she came back down and joined her own body. That's not explainable by my professor having oxygen deprivation to the brain.
Mm-hmm.
Right? She was not ill or injured. And this is very common among people who have what we call shared death experiences, where they are not ill or injured themselves, but they happen to be there with someone else who dies. And as the person in the bed dies, the bystanders themselves have all of these things we call a near-death experience, like getting out of their bodies and accompanying their dying loved one partway toward this light, or even cases, Francois, where people have empathically co-lived the dying life review of the person who was passing away. And to me, that's probably the most shocking thing I have learned in my whole, because I'm not even looking forward to sitting in on my own life review, much less being a spectator.
Of
You know,
the other
and it
one's life.
sounds so embarrassing, but people say that it's not embarrassing at all, because I've learned, you and I have certain kinds of knowledge, and you think about how privileged we are to know the kinds of things that we know about people, which most people don't. And one thing you know, and I know that most people don't know, is that everybody has pretty much the same secrets.
Yes, yes.
That's right.
Yes.
It's like, sometimes I'm sitting there and somebody's building up to this horrible secret they're going to divulge. And when they finally get around to it, I'm saying, oh, that's pattern 7A. I heard that twice last week, and so it's so it makes sense that we would be okay with watching somebody else's life review.
Yeah. But I can relate to now that you're telling how do you mention that? Not seeing the life review of someone, but kind of participating to the departure. I relate to with my father's death. I literally can remember that being
That's right.
connected as something that is not the physical body, and very
Right.
strongly, very, very strongly.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
at that moment, I called it the soul because it's a convenient word.
Yeah.
But as you, I'm not so sure about that. But sometimes I'm just sharing that with you because I'm a practitioner. And why I'm going into deep meditation and I practice my art. I see things, and I see things that are not material. So I'm very prudent. I'm very prudent. But now over time, thousands of times that I've done some healings, heard words, see things, I kind of start, because I also come from a non-believing side, a non-religious side, right? I was pushed into that profession. Well, yeah. So the spiritual aspect is something that is new in your life, right? So
it is. It is.
It is.
It
Because
took me a long time to reach the position that I now have. That, to my utter astonishment, there is an afterlife. It took me a long time, but what finally brought me around was when the doctor tells you that they empathically co-lived the dying experience of their patient, and especially when I hear that from so many doctors who are such good friends of mine, and I would trust their medical judgment completely.
Yes.
So how can I not trust their own unanimous judgment about experiences they had? So to my utter astonishment, there is an afterlife.
Yes.
But that's something I've only come to in the last few years.
Yes. Yes. I have another question that raised my mind is, near-death experience in a way is an out-of-body experience, but there are people that live out-of-body experience without dying. So can you make a certain parallel of that? Because I've lived some. I had very few surgery, but I broke a leg and they had to give me anesthesia. And at that moment, I completely remember everything, 360 degree, the sounds and everything that we can qualify as an out-of-body experience. And also some of my patients in state of very big emergency, when I do some healing to them, they live some out-of-body experience. Is there a parallel to make with near-death experience with this?
I think so. I think that the out-of-body experience is one aspect of the near-death experience, among others. And also the out-of-body experience can occur in other circumstances than almost dying. I have a friend in Paris, Eric Pagani, and Eric is one of the editors of Psychology, but he's also a concert pianist. And he was telling me in 1988, he said he was doing a concert and suddenly he went out of his body into a light and had this amazing experience. And then he came back to the piano and he had played 3 pieces in between with no awareness. It was 17 minutes. And so Eric said, well, if this has happened to me, it's happened to others. So he had a lot of friends who were operatic singers. And he asked mine, and he found a lot of them had these kind of out-of-body experiences when they're performing great music on stage.
Right.
And also, I have a friend who's an astronomer, and years ago he brought me an article from an astronomy journal that describes the out-of-body experiences of astronomers, that quite frequently when they're gazing through their telescopes, they will find themselves out of their bodies looking at their own body from a distance.
Wow. Wow.
And Eric has written a book in Paris on that. You might find it interesting. It was published in the, I forget, 80s or 90s, but it's a really great book.
Yeah. I'm a television producer, Dr. Moody, and the company I work with in Canada, I'm still in contact with them. And some years ago, we've made a documentary about Olympic athletes, and we've called it the Champion Zone, because when they achieve something great, when they're surpassing their physical capacity, the fatigue and the physical pain, then they win. Their physical pain is gone, and they achieve phenomenal accomplishment. I mean, athletic accomplishment, and they all report that. They report that they are living out of their body, right?
Yeah.
Right. Okay, Dr. Moody, my last question. You receive some patient now. You still have people that comes to see you, right? What kind of...
These days, I only do grief work. I don't do any clinical things anymore, except I do counsel people who are grieving.
Grieving. So when they are grieving a death, someone that died?
Yes.
And what do you do with them?
Well, I bet I've reached the same conclusion that you have, that there's two things that help with grief. Number one is talking about it and having someone else normalize your feelings. And secondly, crying. So I just listen to my patients and I talk with them about the grieving process.
So you can talk about dying also. You can comfort them and letting them know that there is something else on the other side, right?
Well, I can't make that judgment from anybody else. What I can say to people is, that's what I've reached, but I wouldn't try to convince anybody else of that. People have got to go through their own process to come to terms with that.
Yeah, but as they know you, I suspect that they are expecting this also, no?
A lot, most people understand, we talk on the phone before they come, so we can talk about, what areas of their problems we're going to address. And some of it has to do with life after death, but a lot of it has to do with life here.
Yeah. So we come back to our first topic. By understanding life after death, we understand life here before we die.
That's correct.
Life before death. Dr. Moody, that was fantastic. I thank you so very much. I can't believe
you're so much
enlightening everybody each time we listen to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's really great being with you.
Thank you. And I will share the link with you. Have a great day, doctor. Goodbye for now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.